Alrighty, I am back again with Melissa Kuberka, who is the head coach at St. John Fisher College in Rochester, New York. She is the head coach for the women's basketball team. If this is your first time listening to Cernig, that's not a surprise. We haven't had a lot of episodes on this podcast, so this may be your first one. But if you've listened to my older podcast, Dynamic Leaders, you might have heard Melissa in the past. She was a featured guest, and we talked all about her coaching and her background. So go back, listen to that podcast, regardless of if you're a new listener or not. Just go check out that episode. It's a really great episode. But Melissa, I'm excited to get you back today, coming off the heels of a 26-3 season as the head coach, as we mentioned, for St. John Fisher College. You won the E8 championship. First, I want to say congratulations again to you, Coach, and welcome back to the world of podcasting.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thanks for having me back on here. I obviously loved our email correspondence, but this is so much easier than seeing that little flag your email that I got to get back to, We can just talk. So appreciate you having me, but also, the kind words about our season. Special group, and they did a lot of really good things.
Yeah, very special indeed. And Melissa's alluding to we're pen pals, and we write a lot back and forth to each other. I really appreciate the time that you take to do that, because both of us have just so many questions. I feel like every single time we go back and forth, and it does take some time. Like, I'll build mine over the course of a couple of days. Like, when I'm responding, I can't just usually do it like in one sitting and everything. But through those exchanges really came the opportunity to speak today, because as we were conversing, back and forth, I think like there were a bunch of themes that have popped up and that continue to pop up, and we're still talking about it, and we'll continue to talk about it in the future. But one of the main themes that had come to mind to me is like, you as a coach, you taking ideas from different mediums like books and podcasts and anything that you can learn from, and how you take those and implement them into your program. And I think that's a really interesting topic, because so many of us, and I've heard this before, an author from a book that I just read recently said, a book is worth it. To purchase a book is worth it as long as you get one idea from it. And like, I agree with that to a certain extent, but I'm like, what good is a bunch of ideas if you never utilize them? And I think that's what has really caught my attention throughout the course of our correspondence, is just to say, like, Melissa talks about these ideas, and then you show me or you tell me about how you've implemented them into your program in one way or another. And I'm like, well, this could be a learning opportunity, not just for me, but for hundreds of other coaches out there who maybe don't have the intuitive ability like you do to connect the dots between learning and implementing. So I'm really going to focus this episode today, just for the listeners here, on taking ideas that Melissa and I have talked about in the past and talking through how she's implemented them into the program. We're going to try not to spill all of the secrets to her success, but she has been gracious enough, Melissa has been, to open up a little bit here and to hopefully help some other people. So, all right, let me look at my notes, Melissa. Let's try to go in relative order here, so we can keep the listeners engaged and keep me focused. So I think my first question, it's less of a question, but it's more of a request. So some people that may not have listened to that feature episode that we just talked about from Dynamic Leaders, let's really quickly, briefly, we mentioned your head coach, St. Fisher College. Can you recap for us, though, what is your coaching style? Like, what is it about coaching and what you're trying to accomplish? Like, when someone says, well, who are you as a coach? What are you trying to accomplish?
So going into my 8th year of being a head coach, I don't know if I have a solid coaching style, because I think I've learned that I need to be fluid with all of it. And my coaching style sort of changes year to year, team to team. But, at my core, who am I? I I was a player who absolutely loved the game of basketball. I loved the teammates that I had, and just going to battle and practice the competitive side of things. I loved the sport and had no intention of going on and coaching once I graduated from college. A lot of things happened, and here I am. And I think, my style has a lot to do with who I was as a player. I'm not a yeller. I'm not super emotional. I'm just focused and committed to the task at hand. And that's kind of how I am as a coach. I don't yell in practice, but man, we're disciplined in practice. We're demanding in practice, but we do it, try to keep the highs and the lows out of it. We stay even keel. And then, we hope that translates to our games where, I'm not in a timeout super rattled, and we stay even keel. And again, I think that our players kind of have taken that from our coaching staff, that we try to stay very neutral in terms of our emotions. But at the same time, we love the heck out of each other, and we are going to go to battle, and the commitment that we make to competing has to be there.
So before we get into some specifics about ideas that you've taken and implementing them into how you coach or into your program with your players, I want to teach a little bit to get everybody warmed up here. You once told me that you feel as though the recipe for D3 success is unlocking, the knowledge of talent within an individual. So there, as you mentioned, like your program, your hardworking, disciplined program, these D3 athletes, like they have those qualities already built into their foundation. And it's up to you to help them understand that they can play at a level in terms of basketball that they may have never realized is possible. Is that accurate in terms of like what you're trying to accomplish when you talk about that?
100%. Yes. I want, we get players, we recruit players out of high school. And so they still have 4 years ahead of them. And if they're the same player they were when I saw them play in high school, when they graduate from here, I didn't do my job, or I didn't put them in a situation that it was probably most beneficial to them. Everyone's going to have different potential for growth, but it's my job to bring it out of them, but also for them to realize what's there. I think that we're at a time, whether it's social media or where kids are told at a very young age that they are great, and it almost, it becomes part of their identity that they're already great, and it maybe can lead to some complacency, where I try to find the players maybe don't realize how talented they are, because that they're still hungry to get better. And I think at our level, that's what I need, is for players who are willing, or who want to get better and are willing to put the time in on their own to do that. And then when they're in the gym with the coaches or their teammates, they just have that buy-in of, I have room to grow and I'm here to get better.
So an interesting thought that came to mind based on basically giving two different examples of players, right? Like ones who maybe think they've already arrived. And as we know, that's never true if you really want to compete at the highest level. And then the ones who just maybe don't realize that they have more potential to unlock, what we talked about, or specifically what you are referencing with some of your athletes there. When you talk about like skill sets, do you think that in a way, I'm not saying this as a blanket statement, obviously, but in a way, it's easier to help with the basketball fundamentals or unlock those basketball skills when you already have those really solid soft skill foundations of like being a good teammate and being disciplined and listening and, all these different things that whether you're on a basketball court, you're in the corporate working world, you're in school, like we talk about soft skills and like it's hard to quantify them, but like it almost seems like if you have that foundation built, then you can really work on the fundamentals of whatever it is, your basketball game, your talent acquisition recruiter like me or whatever. Like, does that make sense? Do you think there's some validity to that, like strengthening those soft skills and then allowing the technical aspect of whatever you're doing to flourish?
definitely, I think that is a part of it, and probably a large part of it. If you're not going to be able to, communicate, whether it's with me as a coach or whether it's with your teammates, you're going to struggle to learn if you're not, able to listen, be able to hear or be held accountable, and to be coached. You're going to struggle. So I definitely think the soft skills are a huge piece of it. And then also it's some of the other intangibles, like just building that trust, that, I am looking out for you, and that, I do have your best interest in there, and that your teammates, as much as you're competing every day and, you're going to bump each other going for that loose ball, you're also able to pick each other up at the end of it and be friends when you're walking out to the dining hall. It's the soft skills are a huge part of it. And then also some of those, the trust piece and the buy-in that way.
Okay. All right. Interesting. So let's go back to what we want to try and teach through this episode today. So when you're pulling from all these different mediums, whether it's a podcast episode, an article that you read, a book that you read, anything else that you want to throw in, can you talk us through the process first of how you refine it into something that's useful? Like, what is specifically your process for identifying, oh, this could be something useful for me, it could be something useful for one of my assistants, it could be something useful for my players, and then kind of walk us through how you relay that information in a way that can be heard by the people you want it to be heard by.
So I think I definitely wasn't always good at this, and I never realized that I was able to do it until, I kind of looked back and said, oh, wow, that's what I was doing. But I think the start of it is to knowing what I believe needs to be a part of our program, kind of like our core values of the program. And, when I, whether it's reading an article, seeing a video on Twitter, or something from a book, when I see things that kind of say, hey, that kind of relates to our core values, is this something that I can share with the team? Another example of, I have it's my voice or my way that I speak it. Can I pull something from this that echoes what I want, but it's from a different voice using different words, something like that. And so I think the biggest aspect of it is knowing what I believe, and again, our core values for our program. So, our core values are excellence, discipline, servant leadership or teamwork, and then love of sport. And so, finding finding articles or things like that. Again, I'm not out, necessarily looking for them. I think information overload is what I think society is, whether it's, scrolling through Twitter or the emails that I get, the newsletter emails I get, there's plenty of information that's there. And as I, process it, it's, does this reflect what we're trying to do within our program? Do I think that this voice would be advantageous to them? A couple ways that I use what I find, every day we do a quote of the day at practice. And, my assistant and I joke, we kind of go back and forth on who gets to pick the quote of the day. And sometimes it's, what topic are we looking for? So, she'll say, let's focus on communication today. And so in the past, I would Google quotes about communication. And that was great for the time at that time, but now it's let's look into what we already have. So plenty of notebooks here full of information and things like that. And then there's also authors who I really respect who, I might pick up some of the books that I have sitting around here in my office and flip through and say, okay, this is what we're going to use today for that. We've come a long way from just relying on Google search and the same 3 websites that don't even let you copy and paste the quote off the page. So, quote of the day is definitely one way we try to build. But then, other pieces are, I often will put articles in their locker. Print them out, put them in their locker before practice, and then I'll, have something on the whiteboard, be ready to talk about this. Or, when they come out, we have our pre-practice circle, I'll say, what are some things you took out of that? How can you apply it to us? And then, big picture with that, obviously I shared with you, we always try to do something over the summer where we take, whether it's a book or in this year, it's different things from all over, but again, trying to take things that I've read or seen or something that reflect what our program is about, and allowing the players to see if they can apply it to ourselves as a program, but also themselves as individuals, whatever field they want to go to, their school life, all of that.
Okay, so a couple clarification questions just to make sure I'm understanding everything correctly. So the first is that it doesn't seem like you necessarily, like, it's not like you have a list or your roster, right? And like your assistant coaches, and you're like, okay, today I need to like pull quotes for X player and Y coach and everything. Like, it's more, it just seems like you kind of, in a similar way, the way I did my research for my book, where I was looking at it in the lens of how I wanted to write the book. And I'm sure there's like a lens when you're reading, you've got that coaching lens on, right? And so maybe you see something or hear something differently than someone who's just listening to it for recreational purposes or something like that. And so it seems like it's much more of a natural thing. Like, if something stands out to you, then you will bring it to whoever you think it's valid for. Otherwise, you're not going to, the information overload, like, you're not just going to push things on. Is that accurate?
That's perfect. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And then I think you pretty much answered this, the other clarification, but one of my follow-ups was like understanding what's important to you. And I think through that lens that I was talking about, it's really the core values more than anything else. And then if like the author or the topic or whatever it is aligns with the core values, then you're going to take that time to dig in deeper a little bit and to look at things, look at additional things maybe by whoever wrote it or talked about it. So is that accurate, you would say, in helping you decide like what you want to share with your team? It's really the core, those 5 core values that you mentioned.
Definitely. I think that the core values help really narrow down what I want our emphasis to be within the program, because I think every coach could list off 50 things that they want to be part of their program, and all of them are valid, and they would build our student athletes, but that would only hit the surface level of all of those things. And so finding that the core values, the ones that we really want to push, and I want my players to walk away knowing what it's like to be a part of a team that loves the heck out of each other, and they're willing to understand deeper what servant leadership is. I think there are, probably 10 different styles of leadership that our players could benefit from learning about. But I think, based on where society is today and what I've learned in my short time of being a coach, is that servant leadership needs to be understood better. I'm not saying you need to apply it in every job that you go to, but you need to, I want my players to understand what that looks like. And so, understanding what I believe, and then trying to recognize when other people say it differently, or, are building on those ideas that help our players learn from. But then there's also plenty of times where it is good to hit a surface level idea for the players. Leadership articles all the time. You and I have talked about our beliefs about captains and things like that. I think it's important for the players, to see different styles of leadership too. We may not dive as deep into transactional leadership as servant leadership, but it is still important for them to understand that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a terrific way to, it's almost like you have a North Star, right? Like the North Star, your 5 core values, and it makes the way that you share information. That's really at the core of like what we're talking about today. It's like, how do you share the most impactful information with your team, knowing that outside of their time with you, they're in information overload, whether it's school, social life, or anything related to that. Or the flip of that is like the coaches who, and there's nothing wrong with getting super into the weeds and whatever, but like you talked about the different learning styles or different leading styles, like not everybody can take in all that information. So I think like being very clear, like that's probably a huge takeaway for people in this episode. Like, use your core values as your North Star, and in terms of your information sharing, like use that as your way to say like, okay, I have all of this, I have a page of notes, but I'm not going to share the page of notes. I'm just going to share 2 bullet points because they really fit our core values the best, and that's going to make the biggest impact. And so I think that's a great way. Would you just really quickly for us outline what your process was for identifying your core values, if that might be helpful to any other coach or anyone trying to establish their own set of values for whatever they do?
Yeah, so here at Fisher was the first time I ever put together core values, and it came out of a bad situation. We had some incidents within the team that I took over, and I, realizing that I was taking over a program with players who were recruited by a previous coach who was different from me. I needed the players to understand who I was and the direction that I wanted this program to go into. So, the first, our main core value is servant leadership, teamwork. And that I identified that because I believe that the best college basketball teams have players who average 14 points a game as their leading scorer, but you have 3 or 4 people in double figures, as opposed to a team that has someone scoring 27 points a game and then their next highest is 6 or something like that. And so
Sure.
the whole idea, the basketball piece of it, of we are going to be a very balanced team, and you could probably go to any other school in our conference and score 20 points a game. Here it's going to be different. Will you buy into that and be a part of the team? And then on the flip side of it, you may sit on the bench, and can you be on the bench and build your teammates up, the ones who are on the floor in the spot that you want. So that's the basketball side of it. And then also, what does it look like in the locker room for us? What does it look like on campus of buying into, a team first mentality? Then excellence, being driven to be great, even when the coaches aren't in around. Being Division III, we get them from October 15th till sometime in March. And so from March through up until the fall, they are on their own. And so can they strive for excellence without us there? Similarly, the discipline piece, both, being able to push themselves like we talked about earlier, but also being able to sacrifice some aspects of college, the social piece, but also, how you may not be able to eat as much in the dining hall as your friends. You may not be able to get as much ice cream in the dining hall as some of your friends because you have practice in a little bit, silly things like that. But can you be disciplined enough to say, hey, I'm in season, this is how I'm going to behave? And then the love of sport. I don't have a scholarship to hang over anyone's head, and I am so thankful that I don't right now. But that also means that there needs to be that intrinsic motivation, or that, I want to be here because I love doing this. And that's for the best player on the team and for player number, whatever on the team. Everyone needs to love being there, because that's the only way we're going to get the best out of everybody.
Yeah, that's so awesome. And I want to just add for people who, because I think sometimes we live in a world where, like, scoring 20, 25 points a game, that's sexy, right? Like that's what people want to do. That gets them Instagram likes, TikTok videos, whatever it is on social media. But the idea behind the balance is something I've read so many of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's books. And he talks specifically about Coach Wooden at UCLA when, this back in the 1970s, but still, I think the point is that you can be successful at finding that balance, and that was their style of play. They won a bunch of national championships at the highest level. Huge 80-something game winning streak. Having Kareem, I'm sure, helped with all of that. But I think it's not crazy when you say that, and then you take in all the other factors of everything that we've talked about up to this point, and just to say, like, that's how you can have a 26-3 season, as you just had last year. So anyone who's listening to this, and maybe if you had a doubt when that came out, like, this stuff works. There's a reason why Melissa and I are talking today. Like, I believe in what she's doing. I want to reiterate that to people, and like really listen to some of the details of what we're talking about in today's conversation. I think will be really helpful. Now, I want to pick a couple specifics, and I'm going to cherry pick from specifics that involve me. So we're not, jumping on other people's toes, but you have been really gracious toward me, Melissa, and using some of the content that I've created to share with your team in a number of different ways. And I want to start with the Dynamic Leaders podcasts. So I want to actually, before we do that, you talked about it a little bit earlier. This year, this summer, you'll call March to October, your very long summer if you want. You have chosen to take a different route than what you normally do. And in the past, if I understand correctly, it was more like, okay, there's an individual book or something like that, where all 20 something players, you're going to read it and you're going to work through it in that sense. But this year, you made a little bit of a pivot. Can you tell us a little bit? You don't need to give us all the details into like what you're asking your players to do, obviously, but like why you decided to pivot into a way that gives them exposure to more content versus specifically focusing on just one or two things.
I think the biggest reason that I changed from a book to a whole bunch of short things, whether it's a podcast episode, an article, even a 30-second video from Twitter. The biggest reason I changed was because that sitting down and reading a book isn't for everybody. You used the term learning styles earlier, and that's I think what a big part of it was, that I would like my players who prefer to hear something to be able to put their headphones in and listen to the podcast episode and go for a run. My players who, want to see something, they can watch the video clips. My players who want to, are okay with reading something, they can read it, but it's not going to take them a couple hours. It's going to take them 5 to 10 minutes. And so I think just being more creative and also being more open to what they might be interested in, what they might take the most from. I'm not saying I won't go back to books, because I think there's a ton of value in reading a book, but my seniors now have been doing this for 4 years, and so just giving them something different. And at like you said with the quote from the book about if you take one idea from a book, it's worth it. Well, if the book has one main theme, that's great. But I said before, if we could hit on 4 to 5 main themes, that would be great. And also if we could get slightly into the weeds here and there, that would be great too. And so, I think it's 9 or 10 different mediums that we use, or different articles, podcast episodes. None of them are very long, and they have all summer to get through it. We will sit down as a team in September and kind of work through it. Don't know exactly with doing it this way how we're going to work through all of it, but basically I just want to give the players an opportunity to hear things, to read things, to see things in a way that maybe will impact them in one way or the other.
Yeah, that's so awesome. And I appreciate you walking through. Basically, it's an off-season exercise, right? And then you get together early in the or late, I guess, in the off season, right before things are about to ramp up, and that's when you do your discovery work together and you start applying. Even if it's just verbally, because you're talking through it. As a team, you start applying all these ideas. And in this year specifically, like you said, you have a number of different themes that you're going to ask your players to work through over the course of the next couple months. So I think that's a really good setup to get us into a couple specific things here as we can top off the show with maybe some specific examples to help people along. And again, I want to start with the Dynamic Leaders podcast. And not only were you a feature on there, but another good friend of mine, Coach Larissa Anderson, who's the head softball coach at the University of Missouri. Her and I have had a number of different correspondence as well. And she has, again, her feature episode. And one of my favorite episodes, one of your favorite episodes, Larissa, is I call her the culture queen. She's a really great, not just a great communicator, but you can tell she's a really great person. And she comes, her husband is a manager at the minor league level for the Nationals, I believe, in Major League Baseball. And they love coaching. They love educating. They go feedback and forth. It's kind of like you and Mick and your relationship, I feel like, which is really cool. But there's a few important themes I know to you from this episode. If you want to go listen to the full episode, listener, feel free, go ahead. You can find it on any of your listening platforms. But for the purpose of today's conversation, let's focus on these couple themes. Let's start with players being an extension of the coaching staff. that was a theme that popped out to you from the episode. What are you hoping to accomplish when you think about that phrase specifically, or that idea specifically with your team? Like when you talk about players being an extension of the coaching staff, like how can you take that idea and make it into something tangible, something that could be useful?
So one thing with everything for this summer, and specifically this podcast episode, was when I met with my players at the end of this past year, the first question I asked them was, what did you like about this season that you want to stay the same for next year? And every returner had some form of the team cohesiveness, the way the team got along, the way our locker room was. It wasn't, I want to win every game by this. None of that. It was, they remembered how their teammates made them feel. And I know that we graduate some players, and so no matter what, the culture is going to be a little different. But I want to find a way to keep that base culture there, and to keep, I want the new freshmen, the new players to come in and to understand what we're all about. And a part of that is having the players be an extension of what we as coaches have a vision for the program, and for the players to see that same vision. They might see it a little differently. And I know we're not going to be the same team we were last year, but if my assistant Hannah and I stick to what we believe, what we want this program to be about, and we're able to, instill that in our upperclassmen, the returners have that, and they're able to then instill it into the freshmen. That's how we continue this going. And it's not reinventing the wheel every year. It's just bringing players up to speed to where we are.
Melissa, I think it says a lot about you and where you have this program, that you could have a 26-3 season and ask that question and not get people saying, I want to go undefeated next year, I want to go even further, but have them talk about the cohesiveness of the locker room, of everybody. Like I just, that's so cool to hear. And I think that's a really powerful thing to take away. And I'm glad that it's a focus, because I just think, that's how championship teams come together. That was the conclusion of my book. I think that's the conclusion of most people. You can't necessarily win a championship without talent, but you can certainly lose it if you have a very talented team but a toxic culture. So I think that's a huge highlight that I just want to just again say, I think it speaks volumes about who you are as a person and as a coach, that would be their response. I don't think, if you had asked me that, I don't know that I would have necessarily thought that it would have been the response. So
and just with that, it's the players that I've recruited. It's not me. It's, that these players, the people that they are, the way their parents brought them up to be, that's the locker room they've created. I appreciate that they buy into what I'm trying to do, but I could have much different players in the locker room, still be me, and they wouldn't feel the same way. It's who they are 100%.
Sure. Yeah. Very cool. Very special. So another theme from this podcast episode, and we've already talked about discipline a bunch because it's one of your core values, but is that work ethic and discipline. So I guess, like, let's take, what are some ideas from the way that Larissa talks about discipline and work ethic, and how are you hoping that that'll enhance what you've already built, as that's part of your current core values?
This sort of is going to take it in another direction, but the one thing that I loved that she talked about was, the family piece of her program.
Yes.
And so many programs say family, 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 and it's that buzzword that you see on the t-shirts and stuff, but how do you actually implement it in your program and make players feel part of a family? And I think that was a huge part of her episode for me, that I wanted my players to hear how, she does it within her own team. But I think that's a big piece of where the discipline comes in, is when you feel a part of the family, you are going to do your part. You are going to put the time in and the effort in, not just because you want the minutes, but because you don't want your teammate who's a senior, you don't want her career to end earlier than it has to. You want to make sure she has a great experience. You want to make sure the incoming freshman have a great experience. And then, obviously yourself and all of that. And so really having that buy into being a part of a family is going to drive you, and being disciplined enough to be able to be held accountable. I think those two things come hand in hand and go hand in hand, and you're able to have conversations, tough conversations, if you are disciplined enough to hear it and willing to be held accountable. And I think, she does a great job in that episode of helping me as a coach see how she puts them in her program in a completely different sport. I think her sport in softball and baseball, you have to be a special person to play those sports, because you get up to bat how many times a game? You strike out, 2 or 3 times, you don't get another chance, until next game. Where in my sport, you can go miss a layup, but you can go play defense. And I think putting it in the lens of her sport really, helped me see, how special I have it with, the game that we play, but also, that a lot of that can be taken to our game.
Sure. Yeah. And you just made me remember, I totally dropped the ball on this. I was going to wear my t-shirt, my swag from the E8 championship day when you were talking about t-shirts. I'm like, totally forgot.
That'll be for the next episode.
Yeah, definitely. Maybe we'll have a new t-shirt too by that point. So, all right. So these are you actually read my mind in terms of, I was going to ask about that family culture too. So we just put those two together there. So I think that covers some of the specifics from the podcast episode that I wanted to get into. And again, please go check that episode out in full if you want to hear more from Coach Larissa Anderson. Let's talk about culture of excellence. So culture of excellence, most people, if you're not familiar, that's the book that I published in 2020. It's a 30-year compilation of the Yankees and their culture and their leadership and how it affected whether or not they were winning or losing on the field, and a lot of cool stories in between all of that. That book was the individual book that you chose to share with your team prior to last season, leading into what you just accomplished as a coach and as a team. So I guess I left this one a little bit more ambiguous for me. I wanted to know, like, if you could share some of the highlights of what came out of that experience in terms of the learning together, and like seeing, it's one thing to look at the record, and we've talked about that a couple of times, but I'll shout it out again, 26-3. It's awesome. But when you're I would love if you could connect not just like what experiences came out of reading the book together, but did you see those themes carrying over throughout the season? Like, did you see those things being applied by your players, by your coaches? I would love to know, like, if that actually took hold and what that all looked like with, even if it's not all of them, but some of the themes that came about.
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, thank you for writing the book, because I do think, whether we were able to, whether that was a pivotal piece of what, why we were who we were, or if it was just a couple players who are going to take some themes from that and apply it to something else in their life. I think it was a great read for them, and we had a handful of Yankee players or Yankee fans on the team, so it maybe piqued their interest a little bit. But so, one thing that really stuck out to me from the book, and was really applicable this past year, was the whole idea of, like the working relationships between players and coaches, or, in the case of your book, with the coaches and upper management and things like that. Because, we were just coming off of a year where I couldn't have players in my office because of all the COVID rules. We weren't having in-person team meetings. Everything was on Zoom. And then, at the start of the season, there were still some restrictions, but it started to open up as we went on. And so I think, having to be adaptable and creative with how we're able to build those relationships with the players through, sort of, different scenarios than what I was used to. Being able to have the freshmen feel a part of the program when they weren't allowed to, lunch with their teammates, that sort of thing. And so, I think one big thing that my assistant and I focused on was how were we going to have better working relationships with the players under the circumstances. And the other piece of it was I was pregnant for a semester, and so normally we would do individuals all the time, and I wasn't able to be in the gym doing those workouts with them, in the same way that I was in previous years. And so in your book, you talked about a whole bunch of different relationships, some that involved people yelling at each other, and some that involved, really good, almost just understanding each other just based on a look. And so being able to really spend the time with the players in, individual meetings in the office, just quick check-ins, in practice, doing a better job of when they were stretching, to go around and make sure that I checked in with a handful of players how their day was. And then during a water break, check in with some other ones how their day was. And it's such a small thing, but I know that I had touch points with the players different than I was able to in the past. And again, I don't know if I hadn't read your book, if I hadn't applied that individually, but at the same time, it gave the players an opportunity to do that too. We have had accountability partners, and what that was someone every week or every 2 weeks who, you made sure your teammate was at practice on time, that they had their sneakers on a road trip, but you also at the start of practice, we might say, hey, check in with your accountability partner on how their day was, or some question. And so I think that was one thing that we know that there's relationships in athletics, but really focusing on what the communication was, and how we were going to foster those relationships, what was one aspect of it.
Yeah, and I think the accountability piece, like having those accountability partners, like maybe is something good that just came out of whether it was partially because of COVID or whether it was partially because you were pregnant at the time, and just knowing that it wasn't going to be the same that it was, excuse me, in the past, but you need to be accountable, and who better to do that than the players on your team, the other people, who are part of your program, and hold each other accountable. So I think that's a really cool shout out. One of the things that I'm remembering that is coincidental, obviously, but the whole switch from in the book from a toxic culture in the late 80s, early 90s into largely the culture that people these days know the Yankees to be, really started with Buck Showalter, who's managing the Mets right now. And the family thing was like at the center of what he wanted to do. And you talk about like a really high stressful market like New York, where the press and the pressure is just extraordinarily high all the time. And Buck Showalter was just like, we need to be more family oriented. We need to have a place where our players' kids and wives and things like that can come and feel comfortable and be with this isn't the 1950s anymore. Like people want to be together, and like whether that wasn't something that you took from the book, but I think it's another validation of like what you're doing as a coach, to see like, all right, this is something that the Yankees did, one of the most successful professional franchises ever, and I'm doing it with my program, and I'm seeing success, as well there. And I'm seeing, good relationships being built and everything. So that was something that stood out to me too, when you were talking about Larissa and the family. And then I was just thinking about the book. I was like, Showalter was, really the one. And that's what's going to be really cool too for you, Melissa, is it's like, okay, maybe you're not going to be at St. John Fisher forever. But maybe you've set the foundation where 30 years from now, however many head coaches come through, it's still going to be that family-like atmosphere, because that's how it is for the Yankees now. Yeah, with their ups and downs and different things throughout that time, but like it's not like the 1970s Bronx Zoo there anymore either. And I think like for you would, in a scenario where you moved on, you wouldn't want it to revert to what you walked into necessarily, right? Where you had some of those bad things. So it's just funny how like it all all comes together. Like now I'm nerding out, and people don't want to hear what I have to say about all this. They're here for you, but
Well, I think you bring up a good point. Just that, there is no one recipe that gets you a championship, but or a great culture, all of that. But I think there are definitely some aspects that have to be there, and whether it's the family piece, or just the cohesiveness. If you don't have that, no matter how good you are or how much talent you have, it's not going to come together. And you may not have the outcomes as consistently. I'm sure there are plenty of championship teams that weren't super cohesive, but I doubt it was sustainable. Or I doubt it, it happened often. And so, I could not agree more that, it's a nice validation of what worked for in one sport for one team, might be, similar things are happening with us.
Yeah. And I think that's the key word. I use excellence as my word for sustainability, but really that's the argument I made in my book. Is it's like, this is what gives you that sustainable year over year success. The Yankees haven't had a losing season since 1992, and it's 2022 right now. And in the professional leagues, like, you're measured off wins and losses, and to a certain extent at the college level, you are as well. And I think, like, it's one measuring stick, right? Like the wins and losses. But I think you see more teams be successful and find those extra wins where maybe they wouldn't have gotten it because, the hustle's not there on the court because they're not playing for each other, or something like that. Like, that's where the off the field, the culture building things, that's where it can spill on to the on court, the on field play. And I think really have an impact to get you an extra win here, or an extra tie in some sports, things like that. So I think it's really special. Are there, just out of curiosity, Melissa, if there's nothing, that's fine, but are there any other examples maybe of themes from other people or other podcasts or something like that you'd be comfortable sharing and talk about? If not, we can wrap it up. But I was just curious if there was anything else that you had to share.
Well, I want to go back with what you just said about, the sustainability and everything. You early on brought up, and from the Coach Anderson's podcast, about coaches being, or players being an extension of coaches. And then, fast forwarding into the working relationships between different people within our program. Again, I think both of those things were huge reasons why we were successful this year. There were plenty of games where we were down, 14 or 16 points early. And I've been a part of teams where we would have folded. There would have been a little bit of bickering. There would have been frustration. There would have been poor body language, and it was over. And we talked in the locker room after the game about how we can't let that happen, X, Y, and Z. This year, we got down and the timeouts were calm. Everyone, we were able to talk through what adjustments we needed to make. And then they went out and they executed. And don't get me wrong, they showed a ton of emotion as they, got rid of that deficit. And then we're up 20 before we knew it. And, the excitement and the love for their teammates was evident. But I think that, there are a lot of, again, different aspects and information everywhere. But some of those key themes have been shown to bring success, like I just said, from this past year. But other themes or other ideas, I'm big on accountability. I think you and I have talked about this. We live in a society where being held accountable, or holding yourself accountable, isn't the cool thing. If anything, you're just putting a target on your back, and it's so sad because we're creating, or we're raising kids to think that blaming someone else is the answer. And I don't like the direction that we're heading in. And so being able to have those conversations about accountability, I think there are tons of examples that we could go with, but, one sort of pivoting again, but, Dawn Staley, after she won the national championship this year, the first thing she did was commend every player who didn't get into games. And she said, these players, their names, they don't hear their names, said on TV, or the PA person at a game doesn't say their names because they don't play, but they're at practice every day pushing these upperclassmen. And I think to me, that's holding themselves accountable. They weren't just going through the motions. Even though they were never going to see the floor, they found a way to push themselves, to push their teammates, all of that. And so, again, I think finding a way to push the like, to use your word for scoring 25 points a game, to push the sexiness of accountability, that will impact my players more than I think anything else will, because I don't think there's a ton of outlets in our society that are saying, hey, hold yourself accountable. No matter what your political views are, no matter what sports team you love, whoever their coaches are, no one rarely says, hey, that's on me, I screwed up. Because you say that, and again, targets on your back, and you could lose your job if you're admitting that you're the one who did something wrong. It's easier to blame someone else. And so, I think there are quite a few examples that we're using this summer in our summer readings and stuff about accountability. But I think that's a theme that us as coaches and parents need to bring back as something that is valid and necessary.
Yeah, I love it. I couldn't have said it better. I think it's something that it bothers me as much as it bothers you, and that sometimes doesn't allow me to have really clear thoughts around it. So I think you talking about accountability in that way is really powerful. And I just want to say too, like, whether it's Coach Dawn Staley, who's at the University of South Carolina, Coach Becky Hammond with the Las Vegas Aces, and Coach, what you're doing at St. John Fisher, I see so many similarities, like the accountability, the way that they're disciplined, the way that they all have fun. You all have fun. Like those things, they're just recipes for excellence, for success, however you want to define that term. And I think you're all great role models out there. And specifically, I'm just so grateful to have you as a friend and someone that we've built a really good relationship here with and can talk about a lot. So I think when I started this new podcast series, learning, interesting conversations, and fun those are my core values for the podcast. So I said, I'm not going to do an episode unless I can get those three things into every episode. And I think we accomplished all three of those things today. So I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time, teaching the way that you did, sharing all of the insight. I know your players are going to love hearing you here on the mic when this gets released, but I also hope there's a lot of other people out there who can learn as much as I have from you. And I think you got something real special, and I'm so fortunate and excited to get to be a small part of it and see you continue to do that in the future.
Well, thank you for being a part of what we're doing. And I think that recognizing those who have impacted, myself or our program is one, or I guess another part of who we are as a program, because we know that none of this was done alone. I've said it a couple times, but the parents of my players did things, in my mind, right to have the kids that they do who are now a part of our program. And my players are able to have success because of people like you and lots of outside influence who help us to that 26-3. So even though your name might not be on the roster, and a lot of people's names are on the roster, we know that it's much more than just the 15 players and 2 coaches who got us here.